You are dumb, Margaret. You have always been dumb. Look at Carol's wife. Look at Denny's wife. They run circles around you. Richard said it over meatloaf, not even looking up from his plate. The words hit me like a slap, delivered by someone I had trusted with 40 years of my life. 40 years. 40 years of his laundry, his mother's funeral, his failed restaurant, his name on everything I owned. But he didn't know what I had already started building in the back room of our house. And in 1 year, he was going to find out exactly who he married. My name is Margaret Ashford, though for most of my life, people simply called me Meg. I am 68 years old, and until the year I am about to tell you about, I believed that being quiet meant being invisible, and I believed that being invisible meant being safe. I have since learned that quiet and invisible are not the same thing at all, and that a woman who has been underestimated for 40 years is holding something far more dangerous than anyone around her realizes. Time, patience, and a very long memory. I married Richard Ashford when I was 26 years old. He was handsome in the way that confident men are handsome. Not because of his face, particularly, but because he walked into a room like it belonged to him. I found that magnetic once. I found it exhausting later. We built a life together in a modest brick house on Larkin Street, the kind of house you pay off slowly and love stubbornly. I raised 2 children, Daniel and Wren, largely alone because Richard's career, first in commercial real estate, later in a series of consulting ventures that never quite consulted anyone, kept him traveling or claiming to travel or recovering from travel. I kept books, not novels, ledgers. I had trained as a bookkeeper before we married, and though I stepped back from formal employment when the children were small, I never stopped doing the numbers. I did our numbers. I did my sister's numbers when her husband left her with nothing but debt. I did the numbers for the church fundraiser for 11 consecutive years, and I did them for free, because that is what you do when you love people and have a gift for something they need. Nobody paid attention to the fact that I could make a spreadsheet sing. Nobody paid attention to much about me at all, if I am honest. I was the woman who remembered birthdays and defrosted the chicken. I was furniture with opinions, and even the opinions were tolerated rather than heard. I kept books for Richard's failed restaurant too, in its brief life, though he never once called it keeping books. He called it helping out, a phrase that let him keep the title of businessman while I quietly reconciled the register receipts against supplier invoices every Sunday night, catching 2 separate instances of an employee skimming cash before they cost him what little margin the place had left. When the restaurant finally closed, $60,000 poorer, it was my part-time bookkeeping income. Modest, unglamorous, $22 an hour in the final years. That covered the gap in our mortgage payments for the 11 months it took Richard to find steady work again. I remember doing the math on our kitchen table that year, stretching $60 until it did the work of $100. And I remember Richard telling his brother at a family barbecue not long after that we got through it together, as though together had not, in practical terms, meant me alone at that table with a calculator while he slept. I am telling you these details not to build a case against him so much as to show you the shape of the life I was living before any of this began. A life of quiet, constant, largely unacknowledged competence, the kind so many women I know are living right now, this very evening, in kitchens across this country, keeping households and small businesses and extended families financially afloat while someone nearby jokes, not maliciously, they would insist about how they don't have a head for numbers. I did not resent that life, not exactly, not for most of the 40 years I lived it. I loved my children. I found real satisfaction in Harold Whitcomb's gratitude, in the church fundraiser's clean books, in the particular pleasure of a ledger that balances to the penny. What I resented, when I finally let myself name it, was not the work. It was being told, over and over, gently and less gently, that the work did not count as intelligence simply because it happened quietly, in the margins, without a title attached to it. But peace has a cost, and I paid it in small, corrosive installments I did not notice accumulating until the year everything changed. It started, as these things always start, in ways too small to name. A comment here, a joke there. Richard had always teased me. That was his word for it, teasing. But somewhere in my early 60s, the teasing curdled into something with teeth. He began comparing me, publicly, to other men's wives. Carol's wife had gotten her real estate license at 60 and was already outselling half the young agents in town. Denny's wife had started a whole online boutique, made more money than Denny some months. He said these things at barbecues, at church potlucks, in front of our own children, with a little laugh that was meant to soften the blow and instead sharpened it, because a joke you cannot object to without seeming humorless is a particularly effective weapon. I want to tell you the specific evening that broke something open in me, because I remember it in the kind of detail you only remember when your body understands, before your mind does, that everything is about to change. It was a Tuesday in March. I had spent that afternoon finishing the year-end reconciliation for Whitcomb Distribution, a small regional trucking company that had hired me. Margaret Ashford, 67 years old, as a part-time contract bookkeeper 18 months earlier, after their previous bookkeeper retired. I liked the work. I liked the owner, a tired, decent man named Harold Whitcomb, who was drowning in receivables he didn't understand and was grateful, genuinely grateful, when I untangled them for him. That night, I had found a discrepancy, nearly $11,000, misallocated across 2 fiscal quarters by their previous accountant. And I had felt, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, something like pride. I mentioned it at dinner, carefully, the way I had learned to mention my small successes. Minimized, apologetic, wrapped in enough self-deprecation that it wouldn't sound like I was asking for anything. I actually caught an $11,000 error today, I said. Harold was very pleased. Richard didn't look up from his plate. That's nice, hon. Then, after a pause, in the tone of a man circling back to something more interesting. You know, Denny's wife just landed some kind of regional manager job. 6 figures, he said. Meanwhile, you're doing Harold Whitcomb's books for what, $20 an hour? 22, I said, before I could stop myself. Right, 22, he laughed, a short exhale through his nose. You have always been dumb about money, Meg. Sweet, but dumb. Look at Carol's wife. Look at Denny's wife. They run circles around you. I don't say it to be cruel. I say it because it's true. I did not say anything. I finished my meatloaf. I washed the dishes. I lay in bed that night beside a man who had just told me, without flinching, that I was dumb. The same word I noted with a strange clinical detachment that a parent uses on a child who has embarrassed them in public, and I understood, with total clarity, for the first time in perhaps a decade, that I was done being the woman he described. Not because I decided to become someone else, because I had never actually been her. I had simply agreed, for 40 years, not to correct the record. That is the moment the pattern crystallized into something I could finally see whole. Because it was not one comment. Once I let myself look, really look, the way I looked at Harold Whitcomb's ledgers, line by line, refusing to let anything slide past me unexamined, I saw 2 years of it. Small erosions. My name left off the deed when we refinanced for simplicity. My contract work described to his friends as Meg's little hobby. A birthday dinner where he'd toasted to Denny's wife's promotion before anyone had toasted anything of mine, though I had just closed out a difficult audit for Whitcomb that saved the man his contract with a major client. I began to understand that Richard did not simply underestimate me. He needed to. My smallness was load-bearing in the architecture of his self-regard. If I was dumb, he did not have to examine why a man with 3 failed ventures and a habit of borrowing against our equity without full conversation had ended up, at 69, financially dependent on the dumb woman's $22 an hour bookkeeping to cover the gap between his pension and his spending. I did not confront him that night, or the next, or the next. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think many of you listening know this feeling intimately. It was not fear, exactly. It was arithmetic. I had watched enough women confront men like Richard to know what happens. The counter-accusations, the wounded indignation, the reframing of the complaint as the crime. Why are you attacking me? I was just being honest. Until the woman ends up apologizing for noticing what was done to her. I did not have the energy, at 68, to fight a battle I could not win with words. So I decided, quietly, over the following weeks, that I would not fight it with words at all. I would fight it with time. Once I started truly watching, in the weeks after the meatloaf dinner, I began cataloging the pattern the way I cataloged everything else, with dates, with specifics, because vague grievances are easy for a man like Richard to wave away, and precise ones are not. There was the Christmas 2 years earlier when he'd bought Carol's wife a gift card for a spa because she worked so hard, unlike some people in front of me, holding my own gift, a box of drugstore chocolates. In his other hand, as though the contrast were simply an observation about the weather. There was the afternoon he'd introduced me to a new golf friend as my wife. She keeps busy with little projects around the house, while I had, that same week, closed out Harold Whitcomb's most complicated quarterly audit to date. There was the way he'd stopped, sometime in the last 2 years, ever asking me a single question about my work at all. Not out of respect for boundaries, I came to understand, but because a question would have required him to imagine an answer worth listening to. I found, once I started looking, that I could not stop seeing it. 40 small moments a year, each one negligible alone, each one a single thread in a rope that had been quietly tightening around my sense of my own competence for a very long time. My mother used to say that water doesn't need force to wear down stone, only time and repetition, and I understood, cataloging those 40 small moments, that I had been the stone, and that I had mistaken the wearing down for simply the shape of being married. There was one person who knew what I was really carrying, and that was my friend Dolores Freeman. Dolores and I had known each other since our children were in grade school together, back when we were both young mothers standing at the same bus stop in the rain, comparing notes on colic and casseroles. Dolores had built her own quiet reinvention 20 years earlier, after her first husband left her for a woman half his age, and she had gone back to school at 48 to become a paralegal. She was 70 now, sharp as a blade, and she worked 2 days a week for a small employment and contracts attorney named Priya Nair. Mostly, Dolores said, because retirement bored me half to death and Priya lets me talk during depositions. I told Dolores everything on a Thursday afternoon in her kitchen over coffee that had gone cold because neither of us thought to reheat it. I told her about the meatloaf comment and the 2 years of small erosions before it and the $11,000 discrepancy I'd caught and the strange, humming feeling I'd had ever since, like a machine that had been idling for decades and had just, for the first time, been asked to actually run. Meg, Dolores said, setting down her cup with the particular clarity of a woman who has waited a long time to say something true to a friend. You have spent 40 years doing skilled labor for free or near free because Richard convinced you that a woman past 60 asking to be paid what she's worth was somehow unseemly. You caught an error that would have cost Harold Whitcomb his biggest client. Do you understand what that means? That is not hobby work. That is the work of a controller. That is the work of a CFO. I laughed at her, the way you laugh when someone hands you a compliment too large to hold. Dolores, I'm 68. I don't have a degree past a 2-year bookkeeping certificate from 1981. You have 40 years of practical experience that half the MBAs Priya hires couldn't match, Dolores said. And you have something else those MBAs don't have. You have absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone, which means you have nothing left to lose by finally trying. She was the one who told me, that afternoon, that Whitcomb Distribution was not a small, stable company treading water. It was, according to what she'd heard through Priya's professional circles, a company being quietly circled by a much larger regional logistics firm called Kestrel Freight Partners, who had been buying up small trucking outfits across the state for the last 3 years. If Harold sells, Dolores said, and he will, because Harold's exhausted and his son doesn't want the business. Whoever has cleaned up that company's books, whoever actually understands where every dollar is going to matter enormously in that transition. That is not a small thing, Meg. That is a door. I did not walk through that door immediately. I am not, despite what came later, an impulsive woman. But I began, from that Thursday forward, to prepare for a door I did not yet know would open. The plan, such as it was, unfolded in 3 stages over the following 10 months, and I want to walk you through each one, because I think the details matter. I think you deserve to see exactly how a woman with no MBA, no formal title, and a husband who called her dumb over meatloaf built something real out of nothing but patience and arithmetic. Stage 1 was simply becoming indispensable, deliberately, where I had once been indispensable accidentally. I asked Harold Whitcomb if I could take on the account's receivable process in full, not just reconciliation. I wanted to see, I told him, where the money actually moves. Harold, relieved to have anything at all lifted from his shoulders, agreed without asking many questions. Within 2 months, I had restructured his invoicing cycle, cutting his average collection time from 51 days to 29, which put nearly $90,000 of previously stalled cash back into active circulation for a company that size. I did this quietly, methodically, the same way I had balanced the church fundraiser books for 11 years, except this time I kept a private file. Every improvement, every dollar saved, every discrepancy caught, dated, and documented. Sitting in a folder on a laptop, Richard didn't know I'd bought with money from a small inheritance my aunt had left me 2 years earlier. Money I had never mentioned to him, not because I planned to deceive him, but because some quiet animal instinct in me had said, keep one thing that is only yours. Stage 2 was education. Pursued in the margins of a life Richard still believed was entirely occupied by errands and grandchildren. I enrolled that summer in an online certificate program in financial management through the State University's Continuing Education Division. The kind of program built precisely for people like me, people returning to formal credentialing decades after their last classroom, taught largely at night and on weekends. I did the coursework at the kitchen table after Richard fell asleep in front of the television, which he did most nights by 9:30, snoring through infomercials he would later claim, if asked, to have watched attentively. I told him, when he noticed the laptop at all, that I was helping with Harold's books. You know how it is. He never asked a second question, because a question would have required imagining that I might be doing something ambitious, and ambition, in his private accounting of me, was simply not a line item that existed. Stage 3 was the conversation I had with Priya Nair herself, arranged quietly through Dolores, over lunch at a diner 2 towns over where nobody we knew was likely to see us. I brought my documentation, 18 months of improvements at Whitcomb Distribution, my continuing education transcripts, and a resume Dolores had helped me build that translated 40 years of unpaid domestic financial management and part-time bookkeeping into the language corporate recruiters actually respect: cash flow management, vendor negotiation, financial controls, audit preparation. Priya looked through it for a long time without speaking, and then she said something I have carried with me ever since. Margaret, I have reviewed the financials of companies twice this size prepared by controllers with half the rigor you've shown here. The market doesn't care how old you are. It cares whether the numbers are right. Yours are right. Priya, it turned out, did more than review contracts for small businesses. She sat on an informal advisory board for 2 mid-sized regional companies going through leadership transitions, one of which was, as Dolores had predicted, Kestrel Freight Partners, the logistics company that had been quietly acquiring outfits like Whitcomb's. Priya made no promises that day, but she asked if she could keep my resume on file, just in case something opens up that fits. And I said yes, and I drove home that afternoon with a feeling I had not had in years. Not hope. Exactly, which felt too fragile a word for what I was carrying. Certainty. The particular, grounded certainty of a woman who has finally stopped waiting for someone else to notice her value and has instead gone and built the evidence herself. The discovery came in October, 7 months after the meatloaf dinner, and it came from 2 directions at once, one professional, one painfully personal, and I have come to believe that life arranges these things in pairs on purpose, as if to make sure you cannot mistake a single stroke of luck for the whole shape of what is happening to you. The professional discovery was this. Harold Whitcomb called me into his cramped office one gray Tuesday morning and told me, with the particular exhaustion of a man setting down a weight he has carried too long, that he had accepted an offer from Kestrel Freight Partners. "They want to close by spring," he said. "My son doesn't want this place, Meg, and honestly, I don't have the fight left in me anymore." He looked at me with something like guilt. "I don't know what happens to your position. I want you to know that. I don't know." I told him I understood, and I meant it, though my pulse was doing something complicated beneath my composed exterior. I called Dolores that evening, and Dolores said only, "Now we wait and see if Priya's instincts were right," which was Dolores' way of telling me not to panic and not to hope too loudly, both at once. The personal discovery came 4 days later, and it was uglier. I had gone to Richard's home office to look for the property tax statement, which he kept, infuriatingly, in a drawer he never organized. And while searching, I found a folder I was not looking for. Bank statements from an account I did not know existed, a personal checking account at a bank 3 towns over, opened 11 months earlier. 11 months. Which meant I would come to realize, once I sat with the dates, almost exactly the same week as the meatloaf dinner. The account held modest sums, nothing dramatic, $4,000 or $5,000 moving through it every few weeks. But what stopped my breath were the memo lines on several transfers. D, dinner. D, flowers. D, hotel, anniversary trip. Not our anniversary. I checked the calendar twice to be sure. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to turn this into something it was not. I never confirmed, and to this day have never fully confirmed, the precise nature of whatever D was to Richard. What I confirmed, with total certainty, from bank statements and credit card records, I spent 3 careful evenings assembling while Richard slept through his infomercials, was this. Over 11 months, Richard had moved just over $18,000 into a hidden account, funded partly from his own pension deposits and partly. This was the part that made my hands shake as I did the arithmetic, from an increase in withdrawals against the home equity line of credit on our house, the one with my name quietly left off the refinance for simplicity. I did not scream. I did not confront him across the meatloaf that night, or any night. I want you to understand something about the woman I had become by that October, 7 months into my own quiet transformation. The old Meg would have wept in the bathroom and then apologized to Richard for snooping. The new Meg, and she was new, forged in continuing education classes and Priya Nair's diner booth and 18 months of Harold Whitcomb's ledgers. Closed the folder, put it back exactly where she found it, and went to see a lawyer of her own. Not Priya. I did not want to complicate the professional relationship that might, God willing, be about to open a door for me. Dolores found me someone else, a sharp, unhurried woman named Fatima Osei, who specialized in matrimonial and elder financial protection law, and in November, alone, telling Richard I was at Dolores's for the afternoon, I sat in Fatima's office and laid out everything. The account, the equity withdrawals, the memo lines, 40 years of marriage, and, almost as an afterthought, the 18 months of professional documentation I had been building in parallel, as though my own reinvention and the unraveling of my marriage had been running on separate tracks that were now, inconveniently, arriving at the same station at the same time. You need 3 things before you do anything else, Fatima told me. You need to secure your own assets. You need full documentation of the marital funds he's diverted, which it sounds like you already have started. And you need to decide, clearly, in your own mind, what you actually want. Because there is a version of this where you leave, and a version where you stay, and simply make sure he never has the power to do this to you again. And those are very different plans requiring very different paperwork. I told her I needed time to decide. She told me, not unkindly, that I had more time than I thought, because Richard, arrogant in his conviction that I was too dumb ever to notice $18,000 moving quietly out of our shared life, had left himself entirely exposed. Men like this, Fatima said, rarely imagine the women they've spent decades dismissing are capable of finding them out. That is usually their whole undoing. The countermove, then, unfolded over the following 2 months, and it was the most methodical work of my life. On Fatima's advice, I opened a fully separate account. Not the small private one funded by my aunt's inheritance, which I now moved and protected entirely, but a new one, documented and legal, into which I began directing every dollar I earned from Whitcomb distribution going forward. A right Fatima confirmed was entirely mine under state law, regardless of what Richard believed about whose money was whose. I obtained certified copies of every account statement, every home equity withdrawal, every D transaction, organized with the same obsessive clarity I had once brought to $11,000 discrepancies in a stranger's trucking company. I updated the beneficiary designations on my small retirement accounts, the ones Richard had never once asked about because he assumed, correctly for 40 years and incorrectly now, that I would simply defer to whatever he decided was best for us. And I waited, the way I had learned to wait, for Priya Nair's phone call. It came on the second Tuesday of January, 9.5 months after the meatloaf dinner, 10 months into my plan, 3 weeks after I turned 69. "Margaret," Priya said, and I could hear something bright and careful in her voice, the voice of a professional trying not to oversell good news before it's certain. Kestrel's acquisition of Whitcomb closed on Friday. They're restructuring the finance function across all their newly acquired regional operations, and they need someone who genuinely understands the books of the company they just bought. Someone who can bridge the transition, someone the existing staff trusts, someone who won't need 6 months just to learn where the bodies are buried, financially speaking. I put your name forward 2 weeks ago. I want you to be prepared. They want to interview you for a much bigger role than the one you had at Whitcomb. Regional controller, possibly more, depending on how the interviews go. Meg, this is real. Are you ready? I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had been told 10 months earlier that I ran circles around no one, and I said, in a voice steadier than I felt, yes, I'm ready. I will not draw out every hour of the interview process for you, but I want to give you more than a summary, because I think the 6 weeks between Priya's phone call and Kestrel's offer were, in their own quiet way, as important as anything else in this story. The first round was a video call with a regional recruiter half my age named Josh, who asked me, not unkindly but with visible surprise, how I planned to handle the technology side of things at my stage of life. A question I answered by walking him, live, through the cloud-based reconciliation software I had taught myself to use for Whitcomb's books 8 months earlier, until his surprise turned into something closer to respect. The second round was the financial modeling exercise. A real scenario drawn from one of Kestrel's actual struggling acquisitions, a fuel distribution company bleeding cash through an inefficient contract structure, and I stayed up past 2 in the morning at my kitchen table, the same table where I had done my coursework, building a restructuring model that identified nearly $200,000 in annual savings through renegotiated fuel contracts and route consolidation. I remember Richard passing through the kitchen at midnight, glancing at my laptop, and asking only, "You're still doing Harold's little spreadsheets?" before continuing on to bed. And I remember thinking, with a calm that surprised me, that in 6 weeks he would understand exactly what those spreadsheets had become. The final round was the conversation with Aaron Delacroix himself, the regional CFO, a sharp, fair man in his early 50s who did not waste time on small talk. He asked me directly, near the end of our hour together, why a woman who could clearly command a much higher salary elsewhere in the industry had spent the previous 2 years working part-time for $22 an hour at a single small trucking company. I told him the truth, or most of it, that I had spent 4 decades being told, by the people closest to me, that my judgment about money and my own worth was not to be trusted, and that Harold Whitcomb's ledgers had been the first place in a very long time where someone had simply let the numbers speak for themselves without also needing to comment on who was doing the counting. Aaron was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mrs. Ashford, I've interviewed 40 candidates for 6 different roles this quarter. You are the only one who has ever answered that question honestly." I did not know, sitting in that conference room, that his honesty in return, the plain, respectful way he treated my answer as data rather than as an excuse to be managed around, would turn out to be one of the great professional gifts of my life. Almost exactly 1 year to the week. After Richard told me I was dumb over a plate of meatloaf, I received a phone call offering me the position of regional controller for Kestrel Freight Partners' newly consolidated Midwest operations, overseeing the finances of 11 trucking companies, including the one where I had once worked $22 an hour, unnoticed, in the back office. 6 weeks after that, following the sudden resignation of the division's president over an unrelated conflict of interest, Aaron Delacroix called me into his office and asked if I would step in, on an interim basis first, and then, after the board reviewed the division's numbers under my stewardship for 1 full quarter, permanently as Chief Executive Officer of Kestrel's Midwest Regional Division. CEO, 69 years old, 2-year bookkeeping certificate from 1981, a continuing education program finished at a kitchen table after her husband fell asleep in front of the television, and 40 years of being told, gently and not so gently, that she was the dumb one. I had not told Richard any of it, not the classes, not Fatima Osei, not Whitcomb's sale, though he certainly noticed I still left the house 3 mornings a week and simply assumed, because assuming was easier than asking, that Harold had kept me on doing the same little job. I had not told him about the account, or the folder with the memo lines, or the fact that I now knew, in granular, documented, notarized detail, precisely what he had done with $18,000 of our shared money over the previous year. I planned the reveal the way I had planned everything else in that year, deliberately, without cruelty, without theater for its own sake, but with absolute clarity about what needed to be said and in what order. I asked Richard and our 2 adult children, Daniel and Wren, to come to dinner on a Sunday in late April, telling them only that I had some news to share. Richard assumed, I learned later, that I had some minor medical update, or perhaps was finally agreeing to sell the house and downsize, a conversation he had been pushing for the previous autumn without ever once asking what I wanted. I cooked a full dinner. I want you to understand that detail, because I think it matters. I was not staging an ambush. I was closing a chapter with the same care I closed every ledger, cleanly, with nothing left owing on either side that I hadn't accounted for. Roast chicken. The good tablecloth. Wren's favorite lemon cake, because whatever came next, she was still my daughter, and I loved her. We ate. We talked about ordinary things, Daniel's boys, Wren's new apartment, the unseasonable warmth of the spring. And then, when the plates were cleared and I had poured coffee for everyone, I set 2 folders on the table. One was thin. One was considerably thicker. I have some news, I said, and I want to share all of it, so I'm going to ask you to let me finish before anyone responds. I opened the thin folder first. As of the 1st of May, I have accepted the position of Chief Executive Officer of Kestrel Freight Partners Midwest Regional Division. I'll be overseeing finance and operations across 11 companies, including Harold's old business, which was acquired in January. My starting compensation is $192,000 a year, plus performance, bonus, and equity in the parent company. I let that sit in the room for exactly as long as it needed to. Richard's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. A kind of collapse and reconstruction happening simultaneously, disbelief fighting with the instinct to recover his composure in front of the children. Meg, that's wonderful, he managed, though his eyes had the particular glassiness of a man doing frantic arithmetic on what this meant for the story he had told about himself and about me for 4 decades. Thank you, I said, and I meant it because it was wonderful, and I was not going to let what came next take that from me. There's more. I opened the second folder. A year ago this March, at this table, you told me I was dumb. You told our children I was dumb, in front of them, comparing me to Carol's wife and Denny's wife, and you have done that, in one form or another, more times over the last 2 years than I think you've ever counted. I counted. I have it written down, actually, dates included, because that is the kind of dumb I apparently am. My voice did not rise. I want you to understand that. It did not rise, because I had promised myself, in Fatima's office, that whatever happened at this table, it would happen in the voice of a woman who had already won, not a woman still fighting to be believed. While you were telling me how dumb I was, I continued. I was catching an $11,000 accounting error at Harold Whitcomb's company that saved his largest client contract. I was finishing a financial management certificate at the State University, at the kitchen table, most nights, after you fell asleep in front of the television. And in October, I found a bank account you opened 11 months earlier, funded in part from withdrawals against the equity in this house. Our house, Richard, the one you took my name off of during the refinance, with regular transfers memo labeled D, I have copies of every statement. I have not spent the last 6 months trying to catch you. You were never that hard to catch. I spent the last 6 months building a life you weren't paying enough attention to notice, and it turns out that was true in more ways than one. The silence that followed was the longest of my life, and I have lived through some very long silences. Daniel spoke first, and I will be honest with you. What he said broke something in me that I did not expect to break, because it was not anger, it was grief, old and specific. Dad, he said quietly, is that true? About the account? Richard did not deny it. That, more than anything else, told me everything I needed to know about the year I had just spent. He said, instead, the thing men like Richard always say when the ground has finally, irreversibly shifted beneath them, it's not what it looks like. It was never. Meg, you have to understand. I felt like I was disappearing in this marriage, and Dee was just someone who... He stopped himself, perhaps hearing, for the first time, how the sentence was going to end, and how little defense there was in it. I'm not asking you to explain Dee to me tonight, I said. I already know what I need to know. I have documentation of every dollar. Fatima Osei has copies as well. I let that name land. He did not know it, but he would. What happened in the weeks after that dinner did not happen the way it happens in the stories people tell for entertainment, with a single dramatic scene and a clean resolution. It happened the way real reckonings happen, in stages, unevenly, with people revealing who they actually are one small decision at a time. Ren broke first, and I mean that gently, because I do not think breaking is always the wrong word for what a person needs to do. She called me 2 days after that dinner, crying, and said, "Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about any of it. Not the account, not what he used to say when I wasn't around." I keep thinking about all the times he made those jokes, and I laughed because I thought that's just how you two were, and now I feel sick about it. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, because she hadn't been the one telling the jokes, and because a daughter's belated understanding of her mother's life is a gift, even when it arrives wrapped in guilt. Rin has since become, in a way I could not have predicted a year ago, one of the people I lean on most. She asked me, 3 months later, if I would help her understand investing, the real way, not the way Dad used to explain things to make himself sound smart. And we now have a standing Sunday phone call that has nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with the relationship we are, quietly rebuilding. Daniel took longer and took a harder road first. His instinct, in the early days, was defense. Not of the account, which even he could not defend, but of the marriage itself, the institution of it. "You've been together 40 years, Mom," he said to me on the phone about 10 days after the dinner. "People make mistakes. Are you really going to throw away 4 decades over one bad year?" I understood where that came from. Daniel had his own marriage, his own investment in believing that commitment survives anything if you simply choose to let it. But I told him something I don't think he expected. "Daniel, it wasn't one bad year. The bank account was one bad year. The rest of it was 40. I am not throwing anything away. I am finally being honest about what was already broken." He went quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I need some time." And I gave it to him, because that is what you do for your children, even when they are grown, even when you are the one who has just been wronged. Daniel came around slowly, on his own schedule, and by the summer, he was the one who helped me move boxes out of the house on Larkin Street without a single comment about whether I should be moving them at all. Richard, for his part, alternated between apology and grievance in a pattern I came to recognize as entirely predictable once I stopped needing his remorse to be real in order to move forward without him. Some days he called and wept and told me he had made the worst mistake of his life. Other days, usually after his brother or one of his old golf friends had clearly gotten to him, he called and told me I was being cold and vindictive, that I had humiliated him in front of his own children, as though the humiliation had originated with me reading a bank statement rather than with him opening one. I did not argue with him on those calls. I had learned, over the previous year, exactly how much energy arguing with a man like Richard actually costs, and I had decided I would rather spend that energy on a business unit with $40 million in annual revenue that was, for the first time in its history, entirely mine to run well. We separated formally in June, with Fatima's guidance and the financial settlement. Informed by $18,000 documented dollars, a home equity line he could not explain away, and my own newly substantial income, which meant I was negotiating from a position of strength I could not have imagined a year earlier, was, in the end, entirely fair. More than fair, Fatima told me, smiling for the first time in months of careful, unsmiling professionalism. Most women your age walk into a divorce with nothing but what they can prove they contributed emotionally, which courts value at approximately 0, she said. You walked in with a career. That changes everything. I want to tell you where I am now, a little over a year after that first phone call from Priya Nair, because I think endings matter, and I did not want to leave you at the dinner table with the folders still open. I live now in a bright, sunlit condominium 20 minutes from the office, small enough that I clean it in under an hour, and large enough for Ren to stay over on the Sundays she visits. I still keep a ledger for myself, out of habit more than necessity now. A private accounting of what came in and what went out, though the numbers on that page have changed so completely from a year ago that I sometimes sit with the spreadsheet open just to look at it, the way you might touch a scar to remind yourself it healed. I oversee 11 companies now. I sit in rooms with men 30 years younger than me who ask my opinion first, not last, and I have learned that the quiet, careful habits of a woman who spent 40 years managing a household on very little, the attention to detail, the refusal to let a discrepancy slide, the patience to wait for the right moment rather than the fastest one, are not a lesser kind of intelligence than the kind that gets praised loudly at dinner parties. They are simply a kind that goes unpraised until someone finally has the sense to look. If I have learned one thing this year that I think is worth passing on to you, it is this. The people who tell you that you are dumb or slow or lesser are very often the people who have built the most fragile understanding of themselves on the foundation of your smallness. They need you diminished because your growth would require them to ask uncomfortable questions about their own stagnation. You do not owe them the performance of staying small so that they can feel large. You are allowed to build, quietly, in rooms they are not paying attention to, until the day the building is finished and can no longer be denied. And the second thing I have learned, perhaps the harder one, is that dignity is not the absence of anger. I was angry. I am still angry, some days, about the years I spent apologizing for my own competence. But I chose not to let that anger drive the car. I let it sit in the passenger seat, quiet company on a long drive, while patience and preparation did the actual work of getting me where I needed to go. That, I think, is the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge wants the other person to suffer. Justice simply wants the truth, finally, to be visible to everyone in the room, including, and perhaps especially, to the woman who spent 40 years believing she was the only one who couldn't see it. There is a piece of this story I have not told you yet, and I have saved it for last on purpose, because I think it explains where the patience came from. Because patience like that does not simply appear in a woman at 68. It has to come from somewhere. My mother, Eleanor, raised 4 children alone on a seamstress's wages in a town where a woman without a husband was regarded, in the language of that era, as unfortunate, a word that managed to sound like both pity and judgment at once. My father had left when I was 9, and I watched my mother, for the following decade, do something I did not have a name for until I was much older. She simply refused to let anyone's low opinion of her circumstances become her opinion of herself. She took in alterations. She kept books for 2 shops on Main Street in exchange for reduced rent on our apartment above the hardware store. She never once, in all the years I knew her, raised her voice at the neighbors who whispered, or the relatives who offered help wrapped in condescension, or the men who assumed, because she was alone, that she was also foolish. She simply outlasted them. She died when I was 41, 3 years before Richard's restaurant failed, and I remember standing at her graveside thinking that the quietest woman I had ever known had also, somehow, been the strongest, and that I had spent my whole adult life believing strength looked like something louder. It was my mother's voice I heard, if I am honest, in Fatima Osei's office, and at Harold Whitcomb's ledgers, and at that dinner table in April with the 2 folders in front of me. Not literally. I do not believe in signs, particularly, though I understand why some of you might. But there is a way a mother's example lives on in a daughter's spine, straightening it at exactly the moments it most needs straightening, decades after the mother herself is gone. When Richard called me dumb over that meatloaf, some old, buried part of me heard my mother's voice instead, the one that used to say, folding a hem with perfect, unhurried precision, "Let them think what they need to think, Margaret. You just keep your own books straight." I did not understand, at 9 or 19 or even 49, what she meant by that. I understood it completely at 68. I think about the early months of my new position often, too, because they were not glamorous, and I do not want to give you the impression that a phone call from Priya Nair transformed my life overnight into something effortless. My first 90 days as CEO of Kestrel's Midwest division were, frankly, exhausting in a way I had not experienced since Daniel and Ren were infants. I inherited 11 companies with 11 different bookkeeping systems, several of which had clearly not been reconciled properly in years, and a board that, whatever Priya's confidence in me, was watching my first quarter with the particular skepticism reserved for anyone whose resume includes the phrase, returning to the workforce. I worked 12-hour days. I made mistakes. A vendor contract I approved too quickly in my second month cost the Peoria operation $11,000 in penalties before I caught and renegotiated it, a bitter irony I did not miss, given where this whole story began. I called Harold Whitcomb more than once, in those early weeks, simply to ask him how a particular root contract had always been handled. And Harold, retired now and clearly delighted to be consulted, told me once, laughing, "Meg, you were running half this place before anyone gave you the title." The title just finally caught up to the reality. There was a woman on my new executive team, the division's head of operations, a brisk 52-year-old named Constance Rivera, who told me something in my second week that I have thought about often since. We were reviewing a difficult contract dispute together, late in the evening, and she looked at me across the conference table and said, "You know, I almost didn't believe it when Aaron told us your background. 69, part-time bookkeeper a year ago, now running the division." I'll be honest, I assumed it was some kind of unusual hire. Forgive me for saying it plainly. Then I watched you handle the Decatur contract in your first week, and I understood. You don't miss anything. You just took longer than the rest of us to get the microphone. I did not take offense at her honesty. I appreciated it, actually, because it was the plainest articulation I had heard yet of exactly what this whole year had been about. Not that I had suddenly become capable, but that capability, which had existed for decades, had finally been handed a microphone loud enough for the room to hear. Richard, for what it's worth, tried one more time to reach me in a way that mattered about 8 months after the separation, in a letter. An actual handwritten letter, which surprised me, because I do not think Richard had handwritten anything longer than a birthday card in the 30 years I'd known him. He wrote that he understood now, in a way he hadn't at the time, that the comparisons to Carol's wife and Denny's wife had never really been about me at all. They had been about his own fear that he had built a smaller life than the men around him, and that comparing me down had been easier than confronting that fear directly. He wrote that he was in counseling, on his own, for the first time in his life. He asked, carefully, without demanding, whether there was any world in which we might someday be friends, if not something more. I wrote back a short letter of my own. I told him I believed his understanding was likely sincere, and that I hoped the counseling helped him, genuinely, because I did not want him to suffer. Anger, in the end, is such an exhausting thing to carry, and I had already set mine down as much as I reasonably could. But I told him, too, that friendship was not something I was interested in rebuilding, not out of bitterness, but because I had discovered, at 69, that I liked the life I had built without him, rather more than I had ever expected to, and I did not want to make room in it for old patterns simply because they had grown gentler with age. I do not know if that was the answer he wanted. It was the truest one I had. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.